Emily de Schweinitz Taylor was not one to rock the boat.
I had a strategy for my life. My strategy was to be the nice one, the peacekeeper, the sacrificer. And in many situations, that really worked well, whether it was growing up in my family, living with roommates, to try to keep a harmonious feeling.
Other times, those strategies, which she now recognizes as avoidance and accommodation, don't work as well. Say, when you're helping leaders from different countries negotiate international policy, or when you have 5 children under the age of 7 and you're trying to get to an appointment on time. Emily has firsthand experience with both of these scenarios. But now, as a professional mediator, she has more strategies to choose from. Welcome to the Why Magazine podcast, bringing you ideas, stories, and voices from Brigham Young University. I'm Whitney Singley Archibald. We all want love at home, with family members smiling sweetly on every side and roses blooming beneath our feet. But real life is a little more complicated.
Everybody's going to get frustrated. Every sibling pair, they're going to have differences. It's not an if it happens, it's when it happens. And so instead of being surprised by conflict, we're just like, oh, I know this happens, and this is what I do when it happens.
That was Emily de Schweinitz Taylor, and today she's going to teach us some of these tools for conflict resolution, 5 to be precise. And then she'll talk about how we can become mediators in our own homes and teach our children to do the same. Emily is more than qualified to teach this. She started her education with a degree in French literature at BYU before going on to study international policy and then dispute resolution. And she just earned her PhD in developmental psychology at BYU. Plus, she's the mother of 5 children whose ages range from 13 to 19. That'll hone your mediation skills. Emily also spent 6 years working at BYU's Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution. It's part of the law school and was originally started to help students resolve differences with landlords through mediation and arbitration, but it's expanded to offer services for other conflicts as well, plus offers classes and workshops. You can learn more about the center in an upcoming article in the spring 2024 issue of Why Magazine, entitled Blessed Are the Peacemakers by Sarah Atwood. Emily Taylor is one of several experts who contributed to that article. I picked up her book, Raising Mediators, to prepare for our interview and promptly filled the margins with notes and started implementing it in my own home. I started my conversation with Emily by asking how she got interested in mediation in the first place.
Early on in my 20s, I worked in what sounds glamorous, like international policy, but what I found was what sounded like a really exciting concept was actually just people sitting at tables, maybe with interpreters, trying to work through difficult issues. And I saw there was the same kind of like emotions, maybe fighting, holding off, those kinds of things. So it kind of planted a seed in my mind that what do you do to get through things that seem intractable, that seem like they can't be resolved? So when my youngest was 3, I really just wanted to start taking some courses and learning. And obviously I had 5 kids in 6 years. So I had a lot of material to work on with helping people learn how to regulate their emotions, work through issues. And we lived in Denver, and there happened to be several conflict resolution programs. So I took a mediation course, and initially I was interested in politics. And I just happened upon research that demonstrated that a child as young as 3 could negotiate with their older siblings if their parents helped them frame the conversation. So instead of having the parent decide how a sibling conflict should end up, these children could do it if their parents helped them. And I had a 3-year-old at the time, so I was obviously pretty
a test subject right there.
Yeah. Well, I was like, okay, like I keep putting all this pressure on myself to resolve my children's conflicts, but ultimately my job is to help them become independent so they can solve their own problems, even with each other. So that's what got me really interested, was the idea that even a young child could imitate really helpful and constructive communication if parents would choose to model it rather than inserting themselves as a judge or just not paying attention to their kids' conflicts much at all. There's just a lot of people who have very good desires to have peace, but aren't really sure how to translate those good desires into, good decision making, all those kinds of things that come with conflict resolution training that I had received. So that's kind of what has become my passion, is to try to figure out how to translate the best of what we know about conflict resolution into all of our lives. I'm just an ordinary person trying to figure it out. And if there's something I've learned, I want to share it. So that's kind of been my mission in life, you would say.
Right. And this, to translate this idea of peace into tangible skills. And that's what you did so well in your book. I liked what you said about how we spend so much time teaching our kids skills like music and athletics and academics, but we don't give the attention to conflict resolution skills.
Yes. I think a lot of times we just hope that if we associate with good people, that some of that will just rub off. But I think especially in our society right now where the values are shifting so much and it's much more individualized, there has to be a more concerted effort to teach, like, what does it mean to really listen? And then how can I actually share what I think in a way that doesn't make other people feel uncomfortable, but I'm still being honest with myself?
You mentioned in your book that there are 5 different approaches to conflict. Can you kind of go through those and then talk about how they interact with each other?
Sure. The main framework that I've really found useful is the idea of 1, you can avoid conflict. That's where you just don't address it. 2, you can accommodate. That's where you kind of give in and you allow the other person to get their way. They can meet their own goal. Compromise is actually sometimes we see it as lose-lose. Like you give up something of what you want and the other side gives up something of what they want so you can settle a conflict. 4th is competing. And that's not necessarily a negative connotation. It just means that you stand up for what you want and you're steadfast about it. You're like, I'm going to go for my goal. And then 5th is collaborating. And that's where the conflict is important enough and the relationship is important enough that I'm going to address that conflict to try to help both of us get what we want. So these all interact because, say, Whitney, you're my roommate. Ideally, I should be using all 5 of these in a day with you. If there's something that's just not really important, maybe both of us just need to avoid it. If there's something that I don't really care about, but I know really matters to you, I'll probably accommodate you. If there's something really like we have to make a quick decision and we generally disagree about, I may just compromise to like get it over quickly. And it's just maybe not that significant of an issue. If there's something, Whitney, you and I talked about last night and we made a decision, we went through the whole thing and you start to renege on me, I may compete with you a little bit. I may push back and say, hey, we talked about this. We already made a decision. I think we should stick with this. And I don't want to compromise on that. And then that 5th part of collaborating, we're not collaborating all day long. But if we use all the other methods, we tried everything else, and we just really can't get through this conflict, and we really care about each other, we need to take the time to communicate long enough and well enough that we can work out something that works for both of us. So all of these are useful. All of them should be used in any given relationship, but it's more according to the situation and the goals that they need to be used interchangeably. So mediation is definitely on that high input level of collaboration. This is something that just keeps happening over and over. We care about the relationship. Everything easier hasn't worked. So we're going to try that. So that's where mediation fits among those 5.
Oh, I love that so much because even as I was first reading the 5 different approaches, I was kind of putting them into a hierarchy. But as soon as I read that they can each have their time and their place, it made so much more sense to me. And I felt so relieved because it felt like a lot of pressure to be like, oh my gosh, do I have to do this every time there's a conflict?
No, I mean, I think that's how, like, especially if you tend to be more of an avoider or accommodator, it can be like, oh my gosh, have I been doing everything wrong? Like there are so many conflicts. Some of those just need to pass right by you. I do not need to get into a road rage incident with this total stranger that I don't know, right? They're not important in my life. But there may be a situation that if you are more of an avoider or an accommodator, you're like, maybe I need to kind of make my skills a little more robust. Maybe I need to try a little harder, just like reshape and have a few more tools So you don't always just defer to what you think is your personality. I think you can actually mix it up and still feel like your authentic self. But it's going to like take a little practice to get those habits fully formed.
Ooh, which has so many implications to raising children too, because it's easy to label your kid as, oh, they're just always going to be competing. There's nothing we can do. That's how he's going to approach all conflict, instead of like, okay, I can see that this is a tendency. Let's give him some more tools. Let's give him some more skills.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
I think people do what they know how to do, and maybe what's been successful in the past. Like that kind of that idea, like maybe this person just always pushes. But if you compete like with a spouse for your whole life, it's not going to go well. Like you're probably going to create some resentment. So you got to put things in balance and in each type of relationship. Jesus is the master of that, right?
Yeah.
He's able to be silent and just like write in the sand at times. And other times he's like, you generation of vipers. It changes depending on the situation. So.
Ooh, wouldn't that be a fun thing to study? Just like to go through all of the conflict that he approaches and look at which strategies he used.
That's actually, I've spent some time doing that because it's really interesting. Elder Uchtdorf in 2021 at Education Week, he actually gave a talk about this. He said, conflict is inevitable. Contention is a choice. And then he said, there were times in His Majesty, he held his silence. Other times that he rebuked those who were, perpetrating unrighteousness. Anyway, like it's really interesting to study his life because we often make a character of Jesus as if he was all soft. And he actually was much more diverse, like in his responses. Yeah. So.
Ooh, the ultimate mediator, right?
He is called the great mediator of all men. So.
What is mediation?
Mediation, very simply, is a guided negotiation. So you have a neutral third party, some kind of person who's kind of stepping out of the actual problem, helping the parties decide how they want to solve a problem. So It doesn't have to be super complicated, but it's just there's another person in there helping guide.
Yeah, and what are some of the advantages of that outside perspective?
Advantages may be kind of laying ground rules, setting up some kind of structure. Usually if someone, even very young people, are in a conflict, there can be a lot of emotions. So if there's someone who's a little bit, maybe even more mature or not as involved, they can structure things and kind of buffer between the two, kind of in a balanced power situation. Balanced power just means both people get to talk. Both people get to help decide what happens. So the result actually represents the interests or the things that people want or need on both sides, instead of just a more powerful party, like an older sibling getting what they want with a younger sibling.
Can you walk us through that with a specific example?
Long ago when I lived in Denver and I had, young children, and there was a specific spot in the morning they really liked right by the heater. It was right near a window looking out onto a park. It was just kind of like the best spot in the house. I come out one morning and as usual, there's kind of this competition for who gets the spot. And as you would expect, it's an older child with a younger child. And it looked like the older child was going to get their way with getting the spot. And in my mind, I'm the third of five. That's not quite fair, right? Like, why does the older kid always get what they want? So my immediate instinct was to make them compromise. So I was going to insert myself and I was going to tell them what they needed to do. And there are times where that's appropriate. But if I want my kids to learn to figure it out with themselves, I need to give them a little space. So I was like, oh, Emily, you're going into judge mode. Most parents kind of come in and they judge a conflict and make a decision. And that's that because they're the parent. That doesn't work as well when you get older, when they're teenagers. So I was about to go into that mode. And I've been learning all this conflict material. And it was just like, no, you got to practice what you preach. You got to stop for a second. So I stopped myself, just even a mental minute. They're still kind of fighting off to the side in that spot. And I was like, okay, if my tendency is to judge, in my assessment, I realized I was judging and it was about me, not my kids, that then I needed to kind of back off. So something I get to do as a parent is I get to scaffold my children's learning. I don't want to do it for them, but I want to be at least on the side to help them move in a good direction, especially when they're young. So the structure I wanted to establish was that they needed to communicate with each other about what they wanted. And the structure I then began was very simple. This is not rocket science,
right?
But it does take a little bit of kind of discipline as a parent. And then I wanted them to hear what each other wanted. So I looked at each of them kind of one after the other, said, well, what do you want? And they kind of looked at me like, duh, I want the blanket and I want the spot. Right? But I wanted them to say it like to each other. So then I acknowledged it and I clarified, sounds like you both want the same spot and the same blanket. I didn't say what they were supposed to do about it. I just kind of summarized what I had just heard. And they're still looking at me like, what's going on with mom? What's she trying on us? So I reframed it and I said, that's interesting. So you both want the same spot and the same blanket. What should we do? And that was very unusual because they were waiting for me to tell them what to do.
Right.
And so there's this a little bit of, again, this is all happening in like 20, 25 seconds. This is like very fast, right? And then I said, well, I'm not the one wanting the blanket or the spot. What do you think the two of you should do? And then they said, well, we'll go run and make a blanket fort. I was like,
wow.
I kind of laughed because like the mediator in me is like, oh, well, they both want to be cozy. They both want to be comfortable. I'm assessing their needs in my head because that's what I would want. But the minute they said they would go make a blanket fort, and that was like perfectly acceptable to the other child, and they ran away and made a blanket fort out of the blanket, it was very clear in my mind that I had imposed what I thought they wanted or needed, and I was about to make a judgment and a decision on their behalf that really didn't meet their needs.
Right.
So the idea is I'm creating a little structure, a scaffold around communication. The research just said that 3-year-olds, if their parents structured their speech so they could share what they thought, they would come up with almost as many options, and then they would both feel satisfied. If I keep doing that as a parent, if it really has to do with them, I'm not ignoring them, but I'm not giving them an easy out. A lot of kids these days have had a lot of oversight, maybe even in their sports activities and so forth. And they haven't had a lot of practice. 1, saying what they need. 2, hearing what the other person needs. And then 3, deciding between themselves. So in a family setting, I really feel like it's the best way for us to teach our kids. And sometimes they'll be like, I don't know what I want. And they'll just be mad. But I don't tell them why they're mad. I may say, hey, we need time to assess, maybe also time to de-escalate. But I encourage my children to make their own decisions because ultimately they're going to be roommates working for someone in a marriage. So especially a sibling is your near peer is what the literature calls it. Someone that is the closest to being on an equal footing with you. And I actually think, especially for a marriage, the idea is to have, equal footing and to counsel with each other. We have to have experience in counseling with each other and making decisions with each other instead of it being all of a sudden, now you're an adult and now you know how to do this. And I think it's much easier to train a child in the way they should go early on, which means that they learn to have some confidence in their own ability to make decisions.
Right. And so I love that you said that sometimes you need time to de-escalate because sometimes in the heat of the conflict, it might not be a time. How do you know when to walk through this mediation process with your kids and when you just need to give a little space and wait?
I would say most often a time to de-escalate is needed. That actually emotional regulation, like the ability to control your emotions is, it's something maybe a lifelong pursuit, but it's especially tricky for young children. So this comes into not avoiding, but maybe that current situation. Say something happens in public. Say I'm at an amusement park and my child's having a, huge meltdown and they're fighting with their sibling, I may say, hey, this isn't the time and place. And then I'm going to revisit it later, or I may separate the kids if I can. That's what's tricky, is you often cannot.
Right.
But even adults, like I thought these were really interesting facts about our brain, that we go into fight or flight or freeze. They have different ways of thinking about that, but it takes about 3 seconds. And to de-escalate takes about 20 to 30 minutes. So I remember I was walking to Walmart and my friend, she had her twins in her cart, and the twins weren't trying to hurt her, but one of them just slammed her head down onto her chin, on my friend's chin. And it was just this idea of, she has pain, so she could just say, I just need a minute. And that teaches a child also, like, oh, mom needs a minute when she's hurting or upset. I need a minute when I'm hurting or upset. So that's kind of where the modeling of, I need to de-escalate, or just say, I'm so upset right now. I'm going to go to the bathroom and get a drink, and then I'm going to come back. So you can buy a little bit of time, or you can buy a little more time and say, I was really frustrated when we were at Target and you were, throwing all the stuff out of the cart. That's never happened before.
No.
So I may address it very briefly in the moment, but then later on, when everybody's calm and maybe they've had food or they've had a nap, and then say, when we were in Target, I was frustrated when you were throwing the things out of the cart. And I'm hoping that next time when we go to the store, you won't throw things out of the cart. And then I may say, if that does happen again, what do you think we should do? What would be a good response for our family if that happens again? And then listen. So I'm kind of like, I'm the negotiating party. You don't negotiate everything as a parent.
Yeah.
Right? But if there's something that I can give a little autonomy to my child, I pace that out and I give them the opportunity to say, well, we should probably go home if I start throwing stuff out of the cart. And as a parent, I may say, I think that might be a good idea. We might just have to say we're going to come back later when we're able to behave better, whatever that is. So there's lots of different situations, but I think we teach respect by showing respect to these little people. That was probably my biggest learning, actually, with having all those children, was I can't coerce respect and obedience, but I sure can structure things so that my children understand that I see them, and then I share with them also what I need. There are times when I even with my teenagers, I come home and just say, I am so tired right now. I had it was kind of a rough day. And I've been surprised. Like, I have a teenager, who will say, wow, that sounds really tough. And it's funny because I can almost hear my own voice. It doesn't always work, but that mix of scaffolding coupled with modeling that as a parent, like, I have needs, and I hope that my children will kind of balance what they need with what they see I need also. So that's kind of at the heart of the parent-led mediation, is teaching kids that their needs matter. They're not just trying to get your attention. They're not just trying to make your life hard. Mm-hmm. When they're fighting, they're trying to see if what they want matters. And so if we actually address it in a constructive way, they can kind of lay claim and become more responsible for meeting their own needs, rather than always looking to an authority figure to satisfy their needs. As I've tried these things out, I have felt a lot more love for my children and my spouse and the other people I work closely with, as I've learned to hear what they need and then also shared what I need.
I could talk to Emily about this all day, but since we don't have all day, the good news is that you can learn more about her research and experience in her 2 books, Raising Mediators and Conflict Fluent, Mastering the 5 Conflict Approaches. And you can listen to the talk she mentioned by Elder Uchtdorf using the link in our show notes. If you liked this episode, you may also enjoy the episode called Essentially and Simply with Greg McEwen, who wrote the books Essentialism and Effortless. We had a great conversation about how to set priorities and then how to make following those priorities more simple. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Y Magazine podcast. Please share it with family and friends. And if you have feedback for us, you can share it through our listener survey. The link is in the show notes. This episode was based on an article that will be in the spring 2024 issue of Y Magazine called Blessed Are the Peacemakers by Sarah Atwood. The Y Magazine podcast is produced by me, Whitney Archibald, with script editing by Kate Hansen. Our executive producer is Brooklyn Romer. Original music, mixing, and mastering by Jarrett Davis.